Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. In this video, I'll outline the process of how I painted this lizard character from sketch to the finished rendering. So this character painting took about 4 hours from start to finish, and to be completely honest, the process isn't usually that fast for me. But since this is such a comfort zone-y character, a lot of decisions I needed to make were instinctual from practice. So this time I won't dive into too much detail, but instead I'll give a brief overview of the process. If you want to see me cover some more specific parts of the process in the future, just let me know in the comments and stay tuned for future videos. So time for the sketch. This is pretty straightforward. I just keep it pretty loose at this stage, just trying different proportions and poses on the fly. I usually end up trying a few different variations of an idea before sticking to one that I like the best. So I make use of the lasso and transform tool to move elements and sections of my drawings into place. I just like to test things out without having to redraw it completely, which saves me a lot of time. So here I decided I want to change up the pose a bit. When I was picturing this character in my head, I already knew I wanted them to be swinging a hammer around. And to play up the weight and power of the swing, as well as the goofiness of the character, I wanted to add more twisting and elasticity to the body and pose. So while I'm making these changes, I'm also starting to think more about the line of action, and I keep adjusting my sketch until I get a nice curve and energy in the pose. I'm also thinking about how the hammer swinging would throw the character off balance, and how they would use their feet and tail to compensate for that. At this point, I try making the free arm look like it was loosely swinging with the body, again just to play up the silliness of the character, but later I scrapped this idea because I couldn't get it looking the way I wanted. Instead, it appears too twisted and looks broken. This is all part of the iteration phase. I like working on my sketches this way, and every time I want to try a different idea, I just duplicate my layer so I can easily compare and go back to previous sketches if I want. At first I wanted the raised leg to be breaking out of the silhouette of the body. I thought it made for a clear read, but later I decided it was raised a bit too much. Even though it made for a funny silhouette, I ended up just continuing the twist of the upper body more into the lower body and brought the leg back down. I thought the pose looked a lot more natural this way, and even though I lost the clear read on the leg when it was popped out of the silhouette, I later try to compensate for this by adding more tonal contrast when I start lighting, but more on this later. Now that I'm happy with the overall pose, I start going back and tightening up the sketch. Here I'm also making full use of the tools Photoshop has to offer, and I use the warp tool to push the C-shaped curve of the line of action even more, and it definitely helps the pose feel a bit more energetic. Instead of making a new layer to do my cleanup lines, I usually just erase and redraw lines that are too rough. I find working this way helps preserve more energy that I had in my sketch, and I don't typically need very clean lines for my personal work anyway. I start to resolve things in the drawing that don't have as much detail or structure yet. Make sure there's no confusing or rough areas that would slow me down later when I light the character. I also make sure to look at reference pics for inspiration, and they can really help guide my design decisions. So this character is based off of a stump-tailed skink, and I really love how big and chunky their scales are, so I made sure to incorporate that in the tail especially. This part of the sketch process takes a bit longer, but overall the more fully realized the drawing is, the more time I end up saving later when I paint and render. So now for blocking in the colors. I start by making a selection outside my line work, inverting the selection, and filling the selection on a new layer. This is also why it's helpful for me to make sure my lines are relatively clean. I usually look at reference to help me come up with my color palettes, and I end up playing around a lot with hue and saturation sliders to help me find the colors I want, and you'll see me doing this quite a bit. I rarely lock down the colors right off the bat, and even when I'm lighting and rendering, I usually go back to play around with the palette. When I was envisioning this character, I knew I wanted the blue tongue of the character as a bright color accent. So I also make sure to deliberately add more cool colors to help unify it with the rest of the color palette, which is largely warm. So namely, I made sure the scales had this slight purple hue, and I also made the hammer have a cool metallic color. I thought this helped make the overall palette more balanced. From this step forwards, I start to check my tonal contrast often. So I use a black fill layer set to the color blend mode to help check them easily. But you can also just squint at your painting as well to see how the tonal contrast looks. Now that I have my line art and palette blocked in, I can start my favorite part of the process, which is shading and lighting. I start by creating a hue and saturation adjustment layer. I set it to dark red, clip it to my color flats layer, and then set it to multiply. I then start painting within the mask to show which parts of the adjustment layer are visible. So I go in and start blocking in the shadows roughly with an airbrush. I'm making sure to check my tonals along the way, and later on I'll refine these shadows. I really enjoy this part of the process because I can really start to see the 3D volume and forms of the character take shape. Now I'm going in with darker shadows to paint in the areas of ambient occlusion and contact areas and creases in the skin. I also use the same adjustment layer to start adding a bit more detailing, like the scales around the character's face and belly. I could spend hours and hours just detailing and carving out each individual scale, but I try to keep things looser to save time. All you really need is just a few well-placed details and the viewer's brain can fill in the rest. I really liked how the scales in one of my reference images were catching the rim light, so I decided to incorporate that too in my drawing. I make a new adjustment layer, set it to a warm reddish white, and this time I set the blend mode to screen. Then it's just the same process as painting in my shadows. I can really start to feel the form of the character now. I'm continuing to check the tonals along the way, and I find the rim light is a really effective way to add contrast to the character and lift it off the background. So here you can see me playing with the colors more. Looking at my tonal, I found there wasn't enough contrast between the base skin color and the larger scales. So I lighten up the yellow and darken the scales to increase the tonal contrast between them. I know I've been talking about the tonal contrast a lot, but I actually think this is a really important step in the process. You can see the colors changing wildly. I usually just experiment this way with the hues sliders. It's a bit extreme, but sometimes I actually get an interesting result and roll with it. So now into finishing steps. I'm adding a quick gradient to start making a simple background for the character. And I'm also creating more hue saturation adjustment layers, either to add more dark shadows or to brighten up areas that are lit. This is all to create more contrast and clarity in the tonal. It can get a bit messy in the layers, but I like the control of being able to turn on and off specific additions to my painting. Next, I block in a contact shadow on the ground. And then I use some photo textures I found to just add some quick interest in the ground plane without too much work, since I want the focus of this painting to still remain on the character primarily. So back to this raised foot. At this point I start to realize that it's getting a bit lost in the body mass, but I want more attention to be drawn to it as a secondary detail. So since I lost the nice silhouette of the leg earlier, what I can do now is increase tonal contrast. So what I did was just darken the shadows under the foot, as well as lighten up the area behind the leg. It definitely helps, and later on I do come back to this and darken the shadows even more to push this contrast. So last minute iterations. At this stage I noticed that the back eye of the character is sticking out a bit too far from the snout. The painting's at a good place, so I group all the layers before duplicating a flattened version of the character. I try not to do this until the very last steps. I find that working with just this one layer, I can much more easily adjust the silhouette and make larger changes quickly. I try a few options until I find the proportions and perspective of the facial features that I want, and then do a bit more detailing in the face, add some effects, and that's it. So here's the finished piece. Hopefully this was a bit helpful in shedding some light on my character painting process. This piece took me about 4 hours to complete, and overall I'm happy with it as just a fun personal artwork. If you have any questions on my process, or if anything was confusing, just let me know in the comments, and I can try to answer what I can in the replies. And if you want me to cover any specific sections of the process more in depth, just let me know, and I'll definitely consider it for a future video. If you thought this was helpful, leave a like, share this video, and subscribe for more in the future. And I'll see you all in the next video.